We're Sainties.
St. Elizabeth University.
St. Elizabeth is the best kept secret in New Jersey. Here, turn your passion into your profession. St. E's has one goal: to support intelligent, determined young women and men, becoming the best people they are destined to be.
The power to learn.
The power to grow.
The power to succeed.
We're St. E's.
St. Elizabeth University. The power to soar.
As we listen to a fascinating topic from Dr. Chris Probst. Dr. Probst is a lifelong teacher and a passionate voice in the world of Holocaust education. From 2015 to 2023, Chris gave lectures to museum docents, introduced and led discussions of Holocaust-related films, and consulted on main exhibits at the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. Following that, he moved all the way to Long Island, New York, where he oversaw and developed educational programs related to Holocaust and genocide studies for students ranging from kindergarten through universities. He trained thousands of students and also reached out to museum educators, planned and executed deeply engaging and enriching public events. In 2025, Chris started Echoes from the Past, which is a publication on Substack, also offering perspectives on history, religion, antisemitism, and intolerance. I cannot urge you strongly enough to please sign up, become a member, follow Echoes of the Past on Substack, from the Past on Substack. It is a great, great read. Chris also conducts half-hour-long interviews with leading members of individuals in Holocaust education. Some of his past interviews have included, for example, Dr. Manaz Afridi, who we have had speak here at SCU a couple of times, and those are available on YouTube. So Chris is a multifaceted, multimedia talent, and it is really my pleasure to have him on our campus today. And so with that, I thank you again for being here and turn things over to Dr. Chris Probst.
He's too kind. Thank you, Rich. That was a lovely introduction. I'm so pleased that you all could come today, and I especially, this is no offense to anyone else, but the sisters who have come to come listen, I'm so pleased that you come to do so today. I hope you'll find it an interesting talk. I'm going to try not to talk at too rapid a pace. I've got a lot I want to cover. We'll take some time for Q&A afterwards. I think this is going to go about 40 minutes or so, but I gesticulate a lot and I use the PowerPoint, so we'll try and keep it interesting for you. So this is Be Glad You Belong to the Persecuted and Not the Persecutors, Rabbi Aron Tänzer in the Weimar Republic. This is the extraordinary story of a man who comforted his congregation, carefully documented Jewish history in his region, and fought anti-Semitism as the Nazis came to power. In my new book, which should be published, knocks on wood, 2027 or 2028, I consider how Protestants who lived in Southwest Germany, you're going to hear me say the word Württemberg a lot today. Württemberg is a state in Southwest Germany. That's all you need to know about that. So when you hear that term, it's going to come up a lot. How Protestants who lived in Southwest Germany regarded their Jewish neighbors from the last years of the Weimar Republic to the effective end of the Allied occupation of Germany in 1949. So this is roughly 20 years of history through one case study today. Did these Protestants seek a world without Jews, as did the Nazi regime and many fellow Germans? Did their attitudes towards Jews change in the years that immediately followed the war? If so, in what ways? Were German Protestant perspectives on Jews and Judaism uniform, or did shades of anti-Semitic thought coexist along with pockets of philo-Semitism, love for Jews, or disinterest about the plight of German and European Jews? Yet I also ask, and this is the question that will be most relevant for today, how did Jews living in Southwest Germany experience the event of these tumultuous 2 decades, 1929 to 1949? With the late scholar Alain Confino, it is not difficult to argue that Hitler and the Nazi regime sought a world without Jews during the Third Reich. Yet, in 1928, 5 years before Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Stuttgart Protestant pastor Eduard Lamparter, who worked tirelessly for the Association for Defense Against Antisemitism, already found it necessary to publish 2 books about the relationship between Protestantism and Judaism. In both books, Lamparter decries Christian antisemitism, countering a portrait of Judaism that he regards as untruthful. He argues in a book titled Evangelische Kirche und Judentum, or the Protestant Church and Judaism, that the greatest danger for contemporary Jewish-Christian relations was the attempt by some Protestant ministers to quote-unquote purify Christianity of all, this is his words, not mine, of all Jewish or Old Testament leaven. I spend most of the book demonstrating that Lamparter's attempts to counter the anti-Semitic views of his fellow Protestants largely fell on deaf ears. So far, the focus of the book, again, has been on what I'll call the Protestant gaze on Jews and Judaism, how Protestants view their Jewish neighbors. Even so, there have been glimpses of Jewish life throughout. These include the harrowing story of Charles Horowitz, a Polish Jewish scholar who worked for Gerhard Kittel at Tübingen University for little to no pay from 1930 until April 1933. Horowitz's work was taken over by Karl Gerhard Kuhn, who, like his mentor Kittel, embraced virulent racial forms of anti-Semitism, including the work of anthropologist and Nazi racial hygienist Eugen Fischer. Having received anonymous threatening notes at his desk and been called out derisively by the name the Jew Horowitz, who is still hanging around as a lecturer at a German university, Horowitz, his wife, and 3 children had to flee Germany and that same month for Amsterdam, and they later ended up in France. Denounced by a French acquaintance while shopping on an open street, Charles's wife Leah was deported to Auschwitz, where she was later killed. And this is a picture of Kittel, the professor for whom Horowitz worked, but was then fired once the Nazis came to power and Kittel started to move his scholarship in the direction of supporting the regime. Horowitz's story, along with the narratives of other Jewish lives chronicled in my book, is centered on the oppression and murder of Jews during the Shoah, or the Holocaust. In the final chapter, however, I examine Jewish life in Southwest Germany from 1929 to 1949, thus offering a glimpse of the Jewish gaze on the collapse of the Weimar Republic, life under Nazi rule in the increasingly oppressive and violent pre-war years, the death and destruction of the war and the Holocaust, and finally, what remained of Jewish life in Germany in the several years after the war. This will provide not only a view from the other side of the Protestant-Jewish divide, but also a perspective that offers an especially unique contribution to our understanding of German history during this era. So I'm making the argument to understand Jewish history as a lens towards understanding the rest of German history at the time. That is, German Jewish life helps us to understand the rest of German life. Historian Shulamit Volkov argued recently that during the modern era, to quote her, German Jews taken as a whole were observing events from a unique perspective. At least one aspect of German history often attracted their special attention, namely what she calls the inherent ambivalence in the way this society handled a great many themes. She called it its permanent double-faced subtext. At times, she goes on and explains that fancy terminology a little bit. At times, the winds of German society were blowing in a progressive direction, presaging a better future. At other times, she says, reactionary, hateful, even dangerous, and finally disastrous winds were raging. And this is all she's talking about prior to the Holocaust. This description captures well the era of not only German Jewish history, but German history, from the political crisis that followed the 1929 US stock market crash to the effective end of the Allied occupation of Germany in 1949. Donald Nievik, another historian, argued that during Weimar's demise from 1929 to 1933, there was a political change that happened. Middle-class Gentile, that is non-Jewish Germans, defected from liberalism, or just liberal democracy, even as most Jews remained firmly in the liberal camp. So there was a split going on between the Jewish and non-Jewish community in Germany politically. This, Liebig argues, was due to a long-standing, deep-rooted commitment on the part of most German Jews to liberalism, that is, liberal democracy, classical liberalism, if you will. This loyalty, intense and abiding, he describes it, was nurtured on gratitude for rights received as the result of emancipation, which happened in the late 18th into the 19th centuries, where Jewish people who previously didn't have the same rights as their neighbors gained more rights and were seen as a bit more part of everyday society. This commitment to liberalism was nurtured on gratitude for these rights and determination to establish a permanent place for Jews in modern European society. This is what they were working toward in this era. In the chapter from which this paper is drawn, I present a history of Württemberg, that state in southwest Germany, from 1929 to 1949, through Jewish eyes, from their unique place in German society. So that's the take that we're going to have today. The Weimar Republic's relatively rapid descent into authoritarianism, seen through Jewish eyes, was a betrayal of those values that had established their almost comfortable place in German society. I say almost comfortable place because of the anti-Semitism of the era. And here I'm talking about prior to the Nazi regime. During this era, things could escalate from a respectable but defamatory whisper at a party to openly radical rhetoric seemingly overnight. German Jews were caught in the crosshairs of these political and social currents. And that brings us closer to Rabbi Tänzer, who's the subject of our talk today. So Gilia Gerda Schmidt, she's a religion scholar based in Tennessee. I think she's retired now. She wrote a book. She grew up in a place called Susan, a very small town in Germany, a short 10-mile trek from another town called Göppingen. Don't worry, there's not going to be a geography quiz after. No map. I'm not going to put any map. I love a good map. My students will tell you if they were here. I love a good map. We're not going to do that today. So Susan and Göppingen were the two towns that she grew up around. And she documents the brief but vital existence and tragic disappearance of both communities in her penetrating book, Susan is Now Free of Jews, World War II, the Holocaust, and Rural Judaism. Beginning in 1849, she gives us a little history here. Jewish businessmen from a nearby town called Jevenhausen began transferring their factories to Göppingen. The manufacture of corsets was a key industry. It took off in Göppingen within 2 years of the arrival of the Jevenhausen businessmen. In 1867, so roughly 20 years in, the Jewish community of Göppingen was formally established with 33 families. So we're talking about a small town and a small group of people. After the synagogue was built, many Göppingen Jews moved to 3 streets that were very near to the synagogue at Freihausstrasse. I have an image of that. Now, what you're going to notice here, this is the Göppingen synagogue, which this building anyway was in existence for just 50 years, 1881 to 1938. If you know a little bit about the history of the Third Reich, your mind can go to where this ends. I will talk about this later in the talk. So this is a Jewish community that only existed for a short span in this territory. Now, if one wishes to get a clear sense of Jewish life in Göppingen, this little town, prior to 1933, one need not look much further than the life and work of Rabbi Aron Tänzer, who is one of 4 rabbis in the short history of the Göppingen Jewish community. As one might expect, Tänzer's writings documented the histories of the Jewish communities that he led and gave them guidance about all things Jewish, what it meant to be a Jew in Germany at that time. Yet they also demonstrated to his detractors that he was a good German. He was just as convinced that he needed to show himself to be a good German. His careful recording of the history of Jewish communities, some large and some small, in several Austrian and German states, the last of which was a history of the Jewish community in, everybody know, Württemberg, we're back in that state, right, was not solely an intellectual exercise. So he wrote a bunch of history books about smaller towns and then eventually about a region in Germany. He was a busy guy. He was a rabbi. As we're going to see, he didn't personally build it. He had a public library built. He was constantly writing history books. And yet, when I started presenting on this topic, I should have started with that. A show of hands. Who knows who Rabbi Aron Tänzer? Most people don't, right? And I didn't before I set out in the archives. Okay. His careful recording of the history of Jewish communities, some large and some small, in these states, the last of which being Württemberg, this was not solely an intellectual exercise. I love history. I love to read history books, and I love to present on them. That wasn't the only thing going on here. Tänzer set out to remember Jewish life in Württemberg, even as the Weimar Republic was collapsing, and the Nazi regime then sought to eradicate the memory of Jewish life and culture. The Nazis did not only set out to murder people, they did, right? But they also wanted to make it as if they never existed. They wanted to eradicate their history, their synagogues, their culture, the whole thing. Tänzer was born in 1871 in Pressburg, Hungary, which is today Bratislava, Slovakia. It's a good thing there's no geography quiz. I'm not so sure how I would score on it. Having studied for the rabbinate to become a rabbi in Pressburg, Aron journeyed to Berlin, where he studied Goethe, philosophy, and other humanistic subjects. This emphasis complemented the Talmudic education that he had received at the yeshiva in Pressburg. He then transferred to Bern University, Switzerland, in 1894. So he traveled quite a bit in this region, sort of southwest and south central Europe. After his graduation, he ended up in a small Jewish community in Poznan, in Poland. Here he became a rabbi and met his wife, Leonora Rosa, whose father was a rabbi. After assisting his father-in-law for a short time, Aron became the rabbi in Hohenems, Vorarlberg, Austria. Small town in Austria. Let's just cut to the chase here. His penchant for documenting the history of a place came to the fore here. Rabbi Tänzer spent 9 years in this small town in Austria, Vorarlberg, and then 2 years in South Tyrol. Later, he took his second theological service exam in Stuttgart. Okay, Stuttgart is a pretty big city. People heard that. He took his exam there to become a rabbi in 1907. He was appointed as a rabbi at Göppingen, where that synagogue is located, just over a week later. So 1907, he becomes a rabbi. He's in his mid-30s. He would remain there for what would be the last 30 years of his life. I've got a couple images of Tänzer. This is one of him as a youngish man, and this is their traditional age college students. Youngish, 35 is youngish. Okay, this is not so youngish. Okay, somebody would say old, right? All right, this is Rabbi Tänzer at his. Sorry, this is in German, but this is Rabbi Tänzer at the entrance to his office, becoming rabbi at Göppingen in the year 1907. So Tänzer was, with many of those in his community, an acculturated German Jew. In 1924, he changed his first name formally to Arnold, a more German-sounding name. As for his rabbinic responsibilities, Rabbi Tänzer was extremely dedicated. He gave sermons, he ministered to the sick, he performed burials and weddings. Every week, his family had guests over for traditional Shabbat dinner, the Sabbath get-together for Jewish people. Tänzer's scholarship became a means for preserving the history of this little town of Göppingen. A prolific author of sermons, speeches for all kinds of occasions, and eulogies, he loved to gather data and write about what he found. So he wrote histories of many German communities, including a bunch of Vorarlberg, Gebenhausen, and finally Göppingen. He was as interested in the broader community, not only the Jewish community, as he was those under his charge in the Jewish community as a rabbi. Thus, to further the reading of quality literature, he created a public library. So he was, civilly minded. When the First World War began, he volunteered to be an army chaplain. He also was a patriot. He loved his country. But it would be a year before his wish was granted. During this year, he hounded the authorities, eventually leading to his being assigned to the German command in the East. While his wife and 2 young children stayed behind, Rabbi Tänzer, along with 2 of his adult sons, served the fatherland with distinction. Wounded in combat, he received a total of 4 German and Austrian medals. 93 Jews from Göppingen served in the army in the First World War. 59 of them served at the front, that is, they saw action, as they say. 7 were killed as well. Tänzer was sent home in November 1918 because of illness. So here is Tänzer in a different uniform. This is Rabbi Tänzer and his military chaplain. Where's his chaplain? Military chaplain, right? Okay. All right. He was chaplain of the German army in the First World War. And there's also other, I didn't bring them all with me, but the Center for Jewish History in New York, where I got some of this archival material, has other photographs of him with troops. So he's a well photographed guy. Okay, so the rabbi's sermons at Göppingen were regarded as legendary by his congregants, one of whom, Lilo Guggenheim Levine, commented that the homilies held our attention, right? That's the speaker, that's job number one, right? Trying to hold people's attention. According to Levine, she wrote a little book about this. Often he would preach, and this is where I got the title for today's talk. Often he would preach, be glad you belong to the persecuted and not the persecuted. And I thought that was such a fascinating phrase. I was giving this talk at NYU where I was a fellow last year. And one of the experts in Judaic studies said, oh, well, that's from the Talmud. I said, thank you very much. Can you explain that to me? And let's walk through it. So the phrase mirrors a Talmudic reference which translates to Rabbi Abahu said, a person should always be among the persecuted and not among the persecutors. It's not good to persecute people. It is better. In other words, he's trying to comfort his congregation when they face persecution. You're in a better place in your hearts, if you will, because you're not doing persecution, unpleasant as all this was. All right. A German patriot and a scholar, Tänzer was also both a spiritual and a civic leader to what was, by 1930, now we're getting closer to the Third Reich, an increasingly beleaguered Württemberg Jewish population. In January 1932, Otto Hirsch, in his capacity as president of the senior council of the Jewish community of Württemberg, the term there is Oberrat, the high council or the senior council, Hirsch wrote a 2-page letter to Tänzer. So Hirsch is this significant, well-known figure in Jewish leadership. Not only in Württemberg, when during the Third Reich, he would become one of the leaders of the Jewish community throughout Germany. So Hirsch is a well-known name. I'm going to write about him in this chapter as well, but Tänzer wrote letters back and forth to Hirsch. In Hirsch's letter, he comments on the recent history of the legal status of the Jewish community of Württemberg by summarizing the recent history of the state's constitution and laws. In so doing, he cites relevant sections of 2 versions of the state constitution, that is of Württemberg, written in 1919. He also points out that the law on the churches of March 3rd, 1924, solved an unresolved issue relating to the status of the Jewish community as a corporation under public law. I know this is getting technical, dry, and dusty, but the dry and dusty stuff really matters here. The Jewish community was becoming a corporation under public law. They were becoming more equal in the 1920s, together with both Protestant and Catholic churches. The language of the 1924 law made clear something that previous constitutions had not, that the Jewish community of Württemberg, not only the Protestant and Catholic churches, which had deep roots in Germany for centuries, had legal standing in relation to things like property claims. Like the property was theirs and they could operate as a corporation under public law. Thus, the Jewish community of Württemberg in the 1920s and 1924 became completely independent of state supervision. They had, credibility with the broader population. This is a picture, just briefly comment on this. I'm really drawing your attention to the man in the middle there, the ministerial rock, the counselor, a head figure, Dr. Otto Hirsch, so who's the leader of the Jewish community of Württemberg. Again, making this, writing letters back and forth with Tänzer. Hirsch's reply to Tänzer focuses on material that parallels chapter 8 of Tenzer's meticulous study. I'll give you just the English translation. The History of the Jews in Württemberg. So this is one of those books I told you about. a draft of which was finished by 1933, but only published in 1937. The years really matter here. This is 37 would be the year that Tänzer died. And given the state of Jewish life in Nazi Germany by 1937, which included the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, nice sounding law title, what it really meant was if you were Jewish, non-Aryan, you couldn't have a civil service job. You couldn't work in university, you couldn't work in government, you couldn't work at the post office, you couldn't have a civil service job if you were Jewish. This all had happened. Again, I'm just sort of walking through just a couple of things that happened in Nazi Germany from 33 to 37. The Nuremberg race laws, which took Jewish people from having that status that I just described as being in place as a corporation under public law. Now you're a Jewish person, like Tänzer, you have fought in the First World War for your country. You're now a subject instead of a citizen. You're going backwards in terms, and of course this had to do with Nazi ideology and the laws that the regime was making. So it's not hard to understand, given that context, why the historian Hermann Dicker wrote of this work, that is Tänzer's History of the Jews of Württemberg. Tänzer had to be very circumspect in his evaluations. He couldn't be that direct. Had to give priority to dates and facts based upon primary sources. As we will see, however, Tänzer possessed both a penchant for meticulousness, yes, and the instinct to confront anti-Semitism in the Weimar era in Württemberg. Tänzer states that in July 1931, the senior council of the Jewish community had commissioned a very narrow work about the history of the Israelite, this is his language, the Israelite senior church authorities. Notice that, it's not a misprint, or it's not the wrong word. Senior church authorities and senior council. Just, it must have been a thing with the, so that the community could understand it. They didn't talk about themselves publicly, the synagogue or the Jewish community. We're the Israelite church, right? Okay, so that their neighbors can understand it. In any case, the council had commissioned Tänzer to write a work about the senior Israelite authorities from 1831 to 1931. This was to be completed by the centenary or 100-year celebration of the Württemberg Jewish community in December 1931. Yet, in April 1932, several months later, the senior council gave approval to Tänzer's proposed broader outline for the book, which covered the entire Jewish community, not just their leaders. What's going on here is Tänzer's having a back and forth with the Jewish community leadership says, we want you to write a book about the last 100 years of how great the leadership is, right? He says, no, actually, I've been kind of working on a book myself for years. It's about the whole shooting match, the whole thing, the whole community, right? He convinces them, says, give me a few more months, I've got this thing working. He then reveals, I've been collecting, I'm quoting Tänzer now, I've been collecting the material for the book for 25 years. He's a good scholar, right? He's got stuff stored away. He wants to write a book that he wants to write. He says, I've always followed and have worked as far as possible only according to primary handwritten sources in order to avoid the incorrect information that is often found in older printed publications. He's a little prickly about this, right? He's like, and he's trying to show his credibility as a scholar. All of this demonstrates him to be both a very scrupulous historian and that he had a clear idea of what exactly he wanted to document for and about his beloved Württemberg Jewish community. Now, again, if this is all sounding all mildly interesting, dry, and dusty, there's a poignancy to this that I'm going to get to here as we come around the bend for the conclusion of what we have because of Tänzer's insistence on doing this that we wouldn't have had. Consisting of 10 chapters, the history of the Jews in Württemberg is a carefully crafted, exhaustive, occasionally dry examination of more than 100 years of Jewish history in the region. Though I will offer some thoughts on a passage in the published 1937 version of the book, most of my comments here pertain to a typewritten manuscript dated 1932. There are some significant differences between the two. On one hand, Tänzer signifies that he will cover ground already tread by other historians, noting that his book offers, his words, a picture of German cultural advancement. Think about this for a second. 1930, right? 33. German cultural advancement in the legal treatment of the Jew, who went from being a tolerated, protected Jew to a citizen with equal rights. So he's writing it just before we get to the part where they lose all of their rights. He's saying, things are going pretty well, right, for the Jewish community here in Germany. Tänzer's book emphasizes the process of the Jewish community coming into its own, not only culturally and religiously, but legally as well. A brief examination of Tänzer's discussions of the 100-year celebration of the Württemberg Jewish community and of the work of an organization called the Zentralverein. This is a German Jewish organization founded in 1893 that advocated for full equality for German Jews, fought anti-Semitism, and worked to strengthen German Jewish consciousness. This demonstrates both the apparent progress of German Jewish assimilation and the ever-present currents of anti-Semitic hatred that existed simultaneously in Weimar-era Württemberg. What I'm painting for you here is a picture of a Weimar-era Württemberg, where Jews were both culturally advancing compared to what they had before, but anti-Semitism is always there. It's always there, whether under the surface or just barely bubbling above the surface. The Stuttgart-based Senior Council of the Württemberg Jewish Community organized what Tänzer calls a modest celebration to celebrate the day 100 years ago when Württemberg's autonomous regional Jewish community was formally organized. The celebration, which took place on December 13, 1931, opened with a welcome address by Hirsch and a ceremonial address by the city rabbi. A series of congratulatory remarks followed. Listen to who was in attendance. Among those present at this 100-year celebration for the Jewish community of Württemberg, Württemberg Protestant and Catholic churches sent representatives. Other German states sent their neighboring states sent their representatives. Outside of Hirsch and the city rabbi, speakers included the state president, right? So if you will, the governor, right? That's sort of akin to the governor of one of our states, and the minister of culture. So this is a celebration for the Jewish community in December of 1931. All right, can anybody raise your hand and tell me when did Adolf Hitler come to power? Not you, Rich. No, anybody know when Hitler came to power? What year?
32.
Say that loud. I heard somebody say it. 1933. This is December 1931. This is just over a year prior to Hitler coming to power. I want this to sink in. 100-year celebration of the Jewish community. Catholic representatives, Protestant representatives, people from the state, and tracking with me. It's really quite poignant because from hindsight, we know what's around the corner, but the Jewish community didn't know what was around the corner. No one really did at this point in time. It's worth noting that in Württemberg, traditional, regional, and family ties were so robust that they sometimes superseded the perceived need for association with the political party. So, for example, the Nazis experienced only modest success in the region, that is, until the regional election in April 1932. This is why historians are so obsessed with dates, right? Because it's more about the progression of things, not so much as just knowing a number, right? Until the regional election in April 1932, in which the Nazi Party won 26% of the vote, which is up from just 9% in September of 1930, right? So there's this period of time, this compressed period of time in which the vote is growing. The affinity for Nazi ideas is growing. So the immediate context of Hirsch's letter to Tänzer amplifies the growing anxiety of the small community of the small Jewish community of Württemberg. This pluralistic celebration played out in a bucolic Württemberg setting a bit more than a year before the Nazi regime came to power. The act of meticulously documenting Jewish history in Württemberg was not merely an academic exercise. By the time Tänzer finished the manuscript, it was also a means of preserving the remembrance of Jewish life there, a direct, if generally careful affront to the Nazi regime's efforts to expunge even the memory of their existence. He was fighting back with the tool of the pen, even before, the real tragedy came. Tänzer's portrayal of the history of Württemberg's Jewish community is often rather straightforward. It's hundreds of pages, by the way. One or two, couple of examples is all I'm going to give you. It's rather straightforward. It's seemingly innocuous if one were to remove it from its immediate historical context. The collapse of the Weimar Republic and the ascent of Hitler and the Nazi regime. Yet, at times, in the manuscript version, the 1933 version, he takes the gloves off as he recounts some of the Central Vereins' rigorous efforts to defend the Jewish community against public anti-Semitism in the wake of the First World War. He says the rich and varied activities of the Württemberg branch of the CV, that's the Central Verein, were less visible in quiet times. But then when times got tough, the CV came out fighting. When, on the other hand, after the unfortunate end of the war, the slander, he uses tough terminology, the slander was spread that the Jews had not fulfilled their duty as soldiers in the field, the so-called stab in the back legend, that Jewish people, pacifists, and communists supposedly stabbed Germany in the back, and that's why Germany lost. None of which is true, but we'll come back to that. The regional association of the CV felt compelled to take a public stand against the malicious slanderers. So this language in his history book is rather pointed. In response, the chairman of the Württemberg chapter of the CV convened a meeting in Stuttgart on December 20th, 1918, during which the strongest protests were raised. He later writes, the ever-increasing crisis of Judenhass, Jew hatred. So this is a term that Germans often used at the time, synonymous with anti-Semitism. That whole term has its whole history, but we can come to that. Ask me about that in the Q&A, okay, if you want. All these different terms that we use at the time. The ever-increasing crisis of Jew hatred, Tänzer writes, brought the regional committee and the Stuttgart local committee such an abundance of work that on January 15th, 1920, they had to set up their own office in Stuttgart, right? There was so much happening post-war, there was so much anti-Semitism, he's saying, that the CV we got to set up an office, we've got to push back, we've got to print books and leaflets, and from this office they could send and distribute books, magazines, and leaflets for refutation and education, to educate the community and to refute the anti-Semitic slander. And here is an example of the type of, you don't have to read German to pick this one up, okay, right? They're anti-Nazi. What do you think that means? What it sounds like, it's the anti-Nazi, okay, and it's sort of press material and material speakers about the NSDAP, that's the Nazi party. Okay. So, on a single day, I'm rounding the bend now, we're almost there. Thus, on a single day in January 1920, I'm quoting Tänzer here, on a single day in January 1920, 20,000 leaflets were distributed by the CV. Other means of, as Tänzer puts it, countering slanderous attacks included public assemblies and meetings for training members of the public on countering anti-Semitism through public speaking. Though anti-Jewish agitation would soon and surely have been deprived of its basis, he argues, the slanderers then protected themselves from such exposure by excluding Jews from their quote-unquote public gatherings altogether. The Jews were even excluded from the meetings talking about their community, right? So they're already losing some rights here. This is 1920. This is during Weimar. In response, the CV had to redouble their publication efforts. So that's just a couple of examples. I'm going to give you one final one here in what I'm calling a coda, not a conclusion. Rabbi Tänzer was dismissed from the Göttingen War Veterans Association in 1933 for being a non-Aryan, for being Jew. So he wasn't a war hero necessarily. He was someone who served his country, right, and fought, valiantly as a soldier, was dismissed from the Veterans Association for being non-Aryan. Absent from the 1937 published version of the history of the Jews in Württemberg is the entire discussion, all of what I just told you about the CV. None of that's there. I'm going to show you in a second what is there. Gone are the references to anti-Jewish agitation, slanderous attacks against Jews, and the CV's efforts to counter public anti-Semitism. The top half of this page is what's left. And in the manuscript, it went on for pages and pages, right? He's talking about the CV's efforts. He's talking about, basically, all you have, and I understand it's in German, most of you probably don't read German, but basically, we're just talking names, dates, and places of people that were part of the Jewish CV. So we just talk about the organization, who led it. There is a reference there So 1926 to Jewish front soldiers from Württemberg and Hohenzollern. So he does defend the fact that Jewish people participated in serving their country. But all the stuff about anti-Semitism, he pulls it back. Why? Because it's 1937, right? This is Nazi Germany. So when he set out to write this book, and he had this 25-year book project, he had all these things to say. He knew he couldn't say it, right? Because it would draw more, even more and more response. Tänzer died of natural causes in Göppingen in 1937 at the age of 66. No obituary or death announcement appeared in the local newspaper. 2 Göppingen residents followed his coffin to his final resting place. The synagogue at Freihausstrasse was destroyed by fire during the Stalin. Thank you very much. I don't always well up at the end, but sometimes even that suggests me just to read it, and I was the third time I was reading the paper. But when I thought about his life, really thought about it a bit. Okay. Questions or comments? Yeah.
So, when we were discussing the period of the Weimar Republic, and kind of that, I also want to read that in my head, like kind of a golden window between the time prior and the time that followed.
Yeah.
What were the precedents or the persons who were pushing for that republic in the first place, and how did they, I don't know if you know, speak text.
Yeah.
I don't know the scope, but just to kind of get
Yeah.
context of.
Yeah, so it was from the very beginning it was contested. Sorry about this. This will help me speak there. Basically, how did the Weimar Republic come to be, and what was their intent in creating it, right? If I understood you right. So the Weimar Republic, right, exists from really November 1918, but really in force 1919 to 1933. And it's right from the beginning, there's this clash. Germany loses the war. They get blamed for the war, never mind the fact that Austria started it, okay? The Austro-Hungarian Empire started it. They were not around, their whole empire had collapsed, the Austrian Empire. So the people that created it were really of different factions. There was the military, there were the liberal Democrats, and these are people who wanted democracy in Germany after having had a very strict monarchy since the nation was founded in 1871. So it was kind of this mix, but there was some tension. There's a term that historians sometimes use to refer to those people who were rational Republicans, and this is not to do, again, when I use the terms liberal and Republican, they don't mean what they mean, whatever they mean now in 21st century America. I don't know what they mean. I used to know. But in any case, when I talk about liberalism here, I'm talking about classical liberalism, the belief in liberal democracy, not authoritarianism, not a monarchy. There was tension over all of that. But it did work. And historians are starting to kind of, there's a historian named Colin Storer, S-T-O-R-E-R, who wrote a book recently. He's kind of revising the history a little bit to say, we don't give Weimar enough credit for what it actually did accomplish. There was a thriving art scene, literature. There was obviously more religious freedom for Catholics, Protestants, and Jews as well. So that's the window I think that you're talking about. There was this window of opportunity, but underneath it all, there were people who didn't believe in it. They were rational Republicans. They went along. They just used their reason to say, okay, we'll go along. But in their, I use the Yiddish term, in their kishkas, in their gut, right? They really didn't believe in democracy. Great question. Yes? Answer? Oh, good question. See, I need to dig a little bit into those latter years of his life. I spent so much time with him in the 1920s, and there is a fair amount of material at the Center for Jewish History I haven't gone through. There's thousands of pages. I've read hundreds in not my first language, right, in German. But that being said, no, I don't think he did. I don't think he gave up. I think he was constricted in what he actually could say and do. And so for me, kind of the poignancy is that he actually put out on paper what he could and said he did what he could. And he ends up being the last, so the Jewish community of Göppingen and Gebenhausen no longer, there's a museum there today, right? And this is true of so many Jewish communities across Europe. You go to Poland especially, where 95% of the Jewish population are murdered in Poland. There's very little left. But I think he was someone who was raised at a certain time in the 1870s and 80s, where there was this belief that Jewish people could coexist, and in fact they did, right, for decades. And it wasn't, historians, we don't, okay, whatever your take is on if you are a believer of some sort, God's providence, fatalism, determinism, whatever, historians don't, I have my own views on theology, but we hate the word inevitable, right? Nothing is inevitable. So the Third Reich was not, I think as the paper showed, right? There's these gatherings celebrating the Jewish community in 1931, so he's like right in the middle of all of that. And then within a year, it's just space is constricted, what we could say, and then and even more so. So his family, by the way, his first wife died around 1912. He remarried. He had a total of 6 children. I can't remember how many with each marriage. I think it was 2 first, 4, 10. All of his children survived. So they were able to go on and they lived in Israel, Germany. I don't know when they came back to Germany. But they went to all different places and sort of established themselves. So I think his legacy lives on, and he kind of did what he could at the time. Yeah.
Chris, in your first book, you wrote extensively about the ideas of Martin Luther and his sense of anti-Semitism. Those obviously never went away, but did they begin to see a resurgence, particularly in that post-1931 era, as you move towards the
Yeah,
Nazis?
it's a great question. Interestingly enough, it actually happens a little earlier. In other words, Protestants in particular, I can't speak for Catholicism. I've got great recommendations. I know I've got lots of Catholics in the office in the audience today. I've got friends and colleagues that have written about the Catholics. Kevin Spicer, Suzanne Brown Fleming. They've written books about this era and Catholicism. But what I'll say for Protestantism, they really didn't need much help from the Nazi regime. And I don't mean to say that most Protestants were like murderous, genocide, in favor of genocide. But they did have these ideas about Jews being Christ killers and enemies of Christianity. Kittel was one of them. I showed you a picture of him. So what I'm getting at here, Rich, is there was something called a folkish movement that started in the mid to late 1920s. And Paul Althaus, who was a revered, very popular professor of Protestant theology at Erlangen, 1927, he sort of lays down a marker and does not just the God and country thing, but like the folk, that is the German people, the German ethnicity, are imbued by God with sort of a special, right? I think this sounds familiar, I'll stop right there. But right, this whole idea that one nationality or one race is imbued by God with something that's better than the other. So it's already present in Protestantism in the late 1920s, and then it gets new impetus in the Nazis. And yes, they did sort of try to. There were a lot of the Protestant vote for Nazism was very strong in most areas of quote unquote Protestant areas, which was the thing in Germany because of Luther. Going back to Luther, the wars that happened, you had sort of regions of Germany that were more Catholic and more Protestant. Good question.
Anyone else?
Oh, back there? Yes?
As a historian, do you see any correlation between there and now?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, no historian is ever going to compare one era to another and say this is just like that. But I do see ideas. I'll give you a term. There's a German term that even prior to Nazism, that viewed foreigners, immigrants with suspicion, for example. And they used the term Überfremdung, invasion of foreigners, right? And it was this idea that was promulgated by prominent intellectuals and also prominent theologians, that people were coming from other countries, in their case, in Germany, coming from Southeast Europe, bringing in other languages and cultures, and that the Jewish people were going to take over, they're taking over our press, our culture, our literature, our this and that. So I do see broad parallels, yes, not just with the United States, but also in other sort of authoritarian governments. Again, one thing is not just like the other. Our history is not German history, and we are 90 years removed, and the means for promulgating such things have changed a lot, basically radio and print. And radio was the new exciting thing, right, in 1930. So I do see some parallels. I think we have to be careful how we apply them, but I think that I'm a little too close for comfort right now, I think.
I was interested maybe more on, are there any, if you know, if the education of that era had a lot to do with why and reference to hearing the voting prior, that kind of show the ideals about the rewards why it had adopted for their action. Can you see anything about how the education played a part in that?
But how education played a part in the
Forming and the acceptance of the Nazi ideas.
Oh, yeah. There was a movement, okay, yeah, I got it. There was a movement called Heimat in Germany in the late 1800s. Historians like Celia Applegate and actually Montempino, who I quoted, this was about history, culture, and folklore, right? And it was more than, it was not just in the schools, it was actually in museums. It was called a Heimat museum, which featured German culture. And on the one hand, it sounds innocuous enough, right? It's just celebrating all these glorious things about Germany. But it was kind of infused with this, this, the German folk are superior to others. And, it's down with all these things. So I think the Heimat movement is one example of that. And it certainly made its way into education. And I think there are plenty of Jewish people, many German Jews became acculturated in part because they felt they had to, and others actually loved German culture, right? They loved Bach and Beethoven and, Mozart, I guess it was Austrian. Yeah. Somebody help me out. Actually, I know he was very famous. But in any case, you can look it up, right? But in any case, they appreciated German culture as well. So the Heimat movement is one example of that. That was very prevalent.
So, how is he able to publish these books?
It was in fact published in Germany in 1937. I don't know quite the story of that. What I do know is what one manuscript looks like and what the other does. And what he published was much more, if I gave you just one example, and that's why the historian Hermann Dicker, who did an analysis of this work, in other words, said he had to be really circumspect, that he couldn't really criticize the regime. He wrote most of it well before the Nazis came to power. And so he tried to reflect some of that history and then sort of dial back the criticisms of antisemitism. He was able to, this was kind of prohibitions on publication and paper rations didn't really kick in until the war. So yeah, he was able to publish it in Germany in 1937. As you can see, he couldn't vote. He just had to make yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. A fascinating topic, and what is extraordinary is that you just continue to learn more and more about the Holocaust and the era, and then we continue to see continuing connections to contemporary events, which is both chilling but also incredibly vital. So thank you so much for your research, and best of luck for the book. I'm sure it's coming in 2027, not 28. And again, the Substack that Chris runs is called Echoes from the Past. Please check it out. Become a subscriber.
One more slide, I'm so sorry.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course.
Shameless promotion. Yeah.
There it is. There it is. So please, Chris does remarkable work. So follow him and be part of what he's doing because it's incredibly important. As is all of you attending here today. Thank you so much for being here. Please check out the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education's website as part of the St. Elizabeth University website. We have 5 more programs coming up this spring, 4 of them on campus. And we'd love to see people on the grounds walking around, checking out how beautiful the school is. And it even looks better when there's not 2 feet of snow. So thank you very, very much for being here. Have a great rest of your Thursday. And it's not too early to say, have a great weekend. Thank you.